And in a variety of roles here at PCC. When I first started, about 13 years ago, one of the projects that I first started working on was actually Notify customization. So this particular topic of how to engage your patients has been something that's near and dear to my heart for a long time. And I've worked with our teams, like our delivery team 34. Thank you. Oh, it wasn't that bad.
Didn't get sticky?
No, it just seltzer. Thank you. So at any rate, I've worked with Delivery Team 34, who puts out a lot of our clinical and patient engagement features. I've worked as a client advocate with a number of clients, done implementation. But all throughout, I've done a lot of work with patient engagement. So this particular talk, featuring Batman here, is going to be about PCC's outreach tools. We're going to spend a little bit of time talking about Notify, broadcast messaging, send text, and the variety of features that we have inside PCC for you to engage with your patients and families. As part of all this, there's always the question of regulations and, who are you working with in terms of, carriers and other entities that you're sending messaging through, and, how those interfere with, you trying to get in touch with your patients, and how to work around some of that. And so we'll talk also about how you can use the patient portal and pre-check-in, and how that's going to change some of the strategies that you folks have in terms of your patient engagement. Out of curiosity, by a show of hands, how many of you are using pre-check-in at this point? Okay, most everybody. And by an equal show of hands, has anybody actually changed their notification cadence as a result of pre-check-in? See, one or two, okay. Because that, again, serves as just another reminder. So as we've built some of these tools like pre-check-in and the like, it's important to think about how that might change, how you communicate with patients, what that cadence is. Do you need a notification going out the same day that the pre-check-in notice is going out, or is that a little bit too much? Okay, so we'll talk a bit about that. When I think about the outreach tools that we have, I really try to break it down to about roughly 4 categories, and we can talk about some of the crossover here as well. We know with our Notify program that we have things like daily appointment reminders. That's what most folks use Notify for. If I look at across systems, I'd say the preponderance of our notifications are simply appointment reminders. With that tool, there is account balance notifications that we have as well. Not that many clients using it. I want to say there's roughly about 6. I have seen some clients start to operate where they use broadcast messaging as a way to send out billing notifications. Curious, is there anybody here who's doing that? Okay. We'll talk more about that as we go along, but we have some folks who use broadcast for that, but we also have within Notify account balance notifications. There's also automated patient recalls. We know with
what is the word limit on Notify? Does anyone know?
Yeah. So the word limit on the notifications that go out to patients and families. It's a typical 144 character max. Okay. And the way that notifications work is that you have your initial notification that says the date, time of the appointment, or the recall type, what that John's due for a well visit or flu vaccine, whatever it is. There's then these trailer messages that get delivered when somebody confirms or cancels an appointment. And those are also constrained by a character limitation. So the overall message itself is 144. Within that, there are some elements, variables that have to be part of that messaging. So therefore, I think realistically, it's about 110 characters on the trailer message, okay. With a small bit of flexibility there, to go over, but that would require some changes to the actual structure of the notifications. We don't do that terribly often, but there have been times where we've had to do that. Good question. And folks know what we're talking about here with the idea of the trailer message with Notify. So with Notify, what ends up happening is, anytime an appointment reminder is sent out, folks get that ability to confirm or cancel that appointment. And you have some ability to customize that trailer message that gets returned. It could be things like, please make sure that you show up to your appointment with an insurance card. Okay. During the COVID pandemic, we had tons of people changing their messaging, to say, hey, please wear a mask, to your appointment, things like that. So there are times where we have to customize or change that messaging, even flexibly. Although, it is kind of a one-size-fits-all approach. We don't typically have, messaging for sick versus messaging for well. It is, across the entire practice. So that's something to consider. So that's what Notify offers. And we'll take a little bit of a look at, notifications themselves and some of the content and the reporting and the like. Broadcast messaging, gives you that, flexible content to really write what you want, as far as a message goes. The intention behind broadcast messaging was really, large batches of messages, to a specific patient population. We built this as part of the work that we did during COVID. So we had heard from folks, hey, we've got this problem right now where we are rapidly changing things like, masking policies and, whether they, they're going to check in through their car, which door they should be, entering through, all sorts of information they want to convey to people very rapidly without having to go one by one, through the system and reach out to each of those people. Or each of those families. So we built broadcast messaging to serve that purpose. The idea was that you could run appointment reports, you could run patient reports, and a variety of other reports through the report library, and then export that through a tool that would allow you to send emails or SMS. Now, I think I heard somebody say, it's too short. So the challenge you run into with that is that, again, it's SMS. An SMS is a constraint, on messaging. So, SMS allows us to have that 144 characters or so. MMS, which is a whole different ball of wax, much more expensive, in terms of implementation and, just the regular cost of it, offers more characters and more flexibility. But, what I say to that is, you want to think a little bit about, how you convey your information. So if you've got a really important thing that you want to share with your families about a new policy, maybe you're sending out that SMS that links back to, a page on your practice website, okay? Now, you don't want to use a short URL because that can get you in trouble. We'll talk about that too. That's where the regulators come into play. But, think about how you want to structure that messaging, where you want to point them to. It's meant to be something short, to the point. A link out is perfectly fine as long as it meets certain requirements. For longer form text, you might send even 2 back-to-back broadcast messages. We've had folks do that where they send 2 texts in a row. First one is, the quick introduction to what it's about. Second one is the link to, the rest of the content on your website. So, that's a way you could engage with folks that gets around, some of that limitation there with broadcast, but we are constrained by SMS. It's unfortunate that, SMS operates the way that it does, but, it is a limitation. We run into that same issue, too, with SendText. SendText is using that same exact platform that we use for SMS for broadcast messaging, lets you send out a text message to a specific patient, one at a time. And these are helpful for all sorts of, purposes, that we'll look at. And those can be accessed through things like the schedule screen, through inside the patient chart. And I'll talk about some of the nuances and things to be careful with SendText. And then last but not least, when we think about outreach tools, our patient portal, serves as, that direct communication, clinically driven, messaging and, communication with your patients and families. We have tools like patient pre-check-in that, are using the patient portal. We've got portal payments, through the portal. So all these tools, kind of underscore the use of the portal as a communication tool, and folks can message back and forth, with you using that. So those are kind of the 4 tiers of messaging that I think about within PCC's outreach tools. And no, the bat phone is not an option. So setup and configuration. When we are building Notify, for any practice, a lot of times we build this out, when you first go live with PCC, and it's kind of one of those set and forget types of things. And folks often forget, hey, how do we set this up? What are we actually using, as time goes on? And so, when you're here at the users conference, I often recommend that you take a good look at how you're doing things. And perhaps it's time to change, a little bit of the calculus that you've been using for notifications or the data that you're drawing upon, for those notifications. When we first built Notify, most folks were using phone calls. And then, a couple of years in, I remember the switch where email became more prevalent. And this is going back a little ways, 13 years ago, that's how things were. And then SMS became, the new way to do things. Everybody wanted a text message. That's how I prefer, to communicate. That's okay. I was like, am I hearing myself in an echo? So at any rate, things have changed over time. And as such, you got to think a little bit about, do your demographic fields support the changes that you're making, in your practice? So that's where I would consider, do you have some way that you're gathering a phone number that is meant for text, a cell phone, something akin to that. There's ways to set up your fields, in your system to support that. I mean, now when folks go live with Notify, oftentimes we have a cell phone field or a text field, and folks are plugging in that phone number that's specifically for text, and we use that as a way to communicate, through Notify. So it's not cascading through and going, okay, let me start here with the home phone, and let me go to the work phone next, and let me send an email if those two fail. It just starts with the text phone. Almost everybody's got that filled out, and it sends out an SMS, okay? And we find that that's typically more successful in terms of reaching your families, getting them to their appointment, getting them to confirm their appointment than, a phone call coming in. I mean, how many people actually pick up their phone these days? I don't care who it's from. Most everything I just let roll to voicemail because, the AI voicemail transcriber is going to tell me exactly what it was. And I mean, if it's the doctor's office and I want to confirm an appointment, sure. But most of the time, I'm just letting it roll to voicemail. Yeah, Eleanor.
Using Notify, that's just a one-way communication, right? They can't communicate back with us to confirm appointments.
Yeah, so Eleanor's question was, when using Notify, it's just a one-way method, can they actually confirm their appointments? The answer is yes. I mean, we can actually set up your reminders to have a confirm cancel option. Some folks, may not want that, cancellation option, as part of their messaging, but whether it's through email, voice, or, text, all of them have that capability for the confirmation. So it's the cancellation that's optional. So some folks choose not to have cancellation turned on because they want people to call the office instead. So, that's something to consider too, where, if we're going to set your messaging up so that there's not a cancellation, usually there's something where, it can say like, please call the office to cancel or something akin to that. But yes, Notify does offer, some communication back. What it doesn't really offer is the ability to text back with some other information, about the appointment, like, hey, 10:15 really doesn't work for me. Is there any chance you guys might have something later in the day? And so that's where they have to use other tools, like you're using SendText, or they're using portal messaging right now to communicate that back. And the challenge of portal messaging, of course, is that it goes to a messaging queue. It's not kind of real-time fast in the way that a text is, and so I'll talk a little bit later about some of the stuff that we're looking at, from a research perspective, to look at kind of a facelift or an update to our notification tools.
But there is that report that they do reply. I always forget to look at it, but you'll look back and you'll see, oh my gosh, look at all this junk here, and it's run back to me.
Yeah, so yeah, for the single text in particular, I'm going to show you guys an example of that report, inside the report library here, where you send out that text message and you think it's kind of one way. They can text back. Now, when they do text back, they get back a message that says this is not monitored for replies or whatever you customize it to. But they've already sent something in at that point. Hopefully they see that text and go, oh, I need to call the office, or oh, I should send in a portal message, or something that's actually going to get responded to. But it is helpful to look at that report. You'd be surprised what you see on there. Maybe not. But I've seen some very interesting information on there. I remember when folks were using broadcast and the like to send out messaging about COVID vaccines. I mean, the number of responses people were getting back that were, very like anti-vaccination focused was really interesting. And plenty of, spicy words exchanged, one way through text. So it's fascinating. You might learn a couple of things, but I think it's also the kind of thing that you want to be running on a regular basis, just to make sure that there's nothing that slips through the cracks. So when we're thinking about, Notify and, how do we set this up for, your practice, what I was talking about here, there we go. Try to make this window a little bit bigger. But, looking at the chart here, what I've done for this particular patient, and hopefully everybody can see that clearly enough. But we've set their phone numbers up to be primary, secondary, cell phone, and emergency phone. Okay, so now in this particular situation, we have a cell phone that's different than maybe the primary number, but oftentimes what I see at practices who build out their setup like this, the primary number and the cell phone are often the same. Okay, I mean, most everybody's using a cell phone these days. You could certainly decide, hey, you know what, we're just going to text that primary number when we build out our notifications, but you might want it, somewhere separate. There are plenty of demographic forms out there, that I fill out for, doctors' offices or whatever, where, they're asking the same information twice. So I think it's pretty customary to expect that, hey, what's your primary number? Do you have a cell phone? Use that cell phone field potentially as your first method of communication, be able to send out that text. If you want to work with us on making this kind of change, it's something we can do. I'm going to get maybe myself in trouble more than the support team, but if he needs to move some of the data around in these fields to match up with those phone field labels, we can do that too, okay? So definitely something worth asking. If you want changes to those labels, data moved around a little bit, these are things we can accommodate for clients. The other thing that people use sometimes that is not really built particularly for this purpose, but has been certainly utilized in this way, is the patient confidential communication preference. So the patient confidential communication preference was a thing we built way back, I believe for like PCMH. It was very early in the days when I started at PCC that we were building this component out. And the idea behind it was that you wanted a way to communicate with that patient in a confidential way. So if they wanted to indicate that, for things like labs or other screenings that we've done, here's the phone number to reach out to that patient at, you had a place to document that. Okay? This is before we had personal contacts as a component or anything else. We had this patient confidential communication preference. And plenty of clients saw this, and we saw this and went, you know what, we could potentially use this for Notify. Since that is one of the methods that can be used. And so people started using this as an accounts communication preference, okay? This is where they would indicate cell phone or, home phone, whatever it was, text. In this case, you would want to indicate text if you wanted to get an SMS. But at any rate, you would set this up, and then the problem with it was that you would have to set it up for each one of the patients in the family. It's not like a thing you can right-click into and say, like a social history component, let's share this with all the other kids, in the family. You would literally have to sit there and type it out for each one. So I often would say, with the caveat like, hey, this is a useful tool, you could use this, it's just gonna be some extra work for your staff. And frankly, with tools that we have now, like pre-check-in, where you've got people filling out information, sending that back to you before their appointment, I think I would want to use one of the fields there instead, as part of the demographic record, to fill in what the cell phone is, because you're getting accurate, up-to-date information and you're not having to go through and update all of this. If you're using confidential communication preference right now as one of your methods of communication, it might be time to reconsider doing that, especially with pre-check-in, since you're getting that accurate information. Like, do you really want to have staff go through and update that, 4 or 5, however many times over, based on the number of kids in that family, okay? Any questions about that at all? Yeah.
One question from the chat. If the practice is using Notify, and how do they know if they have the cancellation option? I gave an answer. I think it's if Notify is enabled, parents will always have the option to cancel.
Yeah, so the question, Jolie, from this is from online, was if somebody has Notify set up, how do they know if they have that cancellation option enabled? That cancellation option is something that we build in as part of the setup for your practice. So there's this whole worksheet that we fill out, that we send over to Televox, and they build out your customization accordingly. If you're wondering, reach out to us. Send us an email to support@pcc.com. We will take a look and make sure that you've got it set up correctly. If you don't and you want to make a change, easy enough for us to do that. Changes typically take a couple of days. Sometimes a little bit longer if we're talking translations, from English to another language for alternate messaging. But for something as simple as that, probably just a couple of days for the switch to be flipped. Good question. So anyway, that's that confidential communication preference. Another thing to think about when we're building Notify, out is, kind of how many notifications do you need? When you first built this out, before you had pre-check-in or Chattis, if you're using Chattis, there's another notification that goes out about an appointment. Please, fill out these questionnaires. Oh, and by the way, you've got an appointment on this date. You're driving them to the portal. They're going to see the information there. You might have started out with, 3, 4 text messages or, messages about appointments. It's time to consider, do you need to cut that down? We've talked about this before, at Chattis workshops and pre-check-in about, modifying your notification cadence, but it is something to consider, and I feel like practices do hear from families like, hey, we get way too many texts or we get way too many calls and emails. Take that into consideration. And, I think the reason that people do that is because they're concerned about missed appointments, right? And I've heard, whether it's Chip or others say, when you think about like who's going to miss appointments, it's like, 20% of your practice, maybe even 10%, makes up like 80 to 90% of your missed appointments when you think about it, right? So why send out 5 notifications to somebody who's not going to miss their appointment, when really what you want to do is target, the frequent flyers and the frequent offenders. Build out, a program within your system where using patient flags and the like, or account flags, flagging those folks and building additional notification batches for those people specifically. Does anybody do that right now, where they have like a special, frequent flyer, missed appointment batch? Something to consider, and you don't necessarily have to use Notify for that either. I mean, you could have a report that you run, like your huddle sheet, whatever it is, look the day before at, who those folks are, use send text, send those texts out. I mean, Notify has a cost associated with it, send text doesn't, okay? But there isn't a confirm cancel option with send text either, so, it's your choice how you want to do this. And if you want the set and forget approach, use flags, use Notify and build a separate batch. If you have a question on how to do that, reach out to us. We'll help you out with that, okay? I know a couple of clients that do that right now, where they flag folks, whether it's, because they miss so many appointments they can't double book, or, book 2 kids, in the same day, or they send these additional notifications, and that's, I think, a handy approach. And especially when we're considering, like, maybe too many notifications are going out, like, alter your approach a little bit there. So that's, Notify, kind of in a nutshell there. Let's talk a little bit about broadcast messaging. So broadcast, we built this out again to be that flexible way to communicate with patients and families, and all of it driven through the report library. So, we have a whole series of reports that you can access. Most of them, have broadcast enabled. There are some that don't. But you can utilize those reports, set the criteria that you want, and then shoot out a message to those folks, based on the typical contacts that you would want to send to. So what I've pulled up here is your practice preferences, okay? So inside practice preferences, we get to determine, how our message is going to be sent out. When it comes to, text, for example, are we, sending an SMS to the home account, across all phone fields? Now, of course, the phone fields that are listed here are, whatever database, set up. So these would be reflective of your particular phone fields. We also have the capability to send a text to the confidential communication preference phone, and then ultimately the portal users who are connected to these families. A question that I often get about broadcasts, like, hey, you've got all these numbers listed here, but like, do we end up with a situation where, the patient, there's like 3 or 4 patients, for that family that appear on that report? Do they get 3 or 4 messages to that single phone number? And the answer is no. We deduplicate. So, if you've got 10,000 patients that you're going to send a message out to, but how many of them belong to families, and it's really more like 5,000 contacts, you're sending out 5,000 messages there. Okay? Yes?
Question. So when we broadcast message, I typically do it by SMS.
Yep.
You can actually send a message to the portal?
Yeah, so the question was, when we broadcast message, we typically use SMS. You can send it to the portal. You can send it to the portal user's phone. So it's not actually going to the portal itself. What it's doing is it's sending a text message to the portal users who are associated with that patient. So, you might have, mom listed as, the home and billing account, right? But you also want to make sure that dad is getting, a message. And if he's got, his cell phone, listed there for portal notification, then he's going to get, a text as well. So, yeah, so it's in practice preferences. Let me show you where it is, okay? I love practice preferences because I usually scroll past everything at least once or twice before I get there. So go to config, practice preferences, like, jam everything in, preference-wise in the system. But as you scroll down, there we go, okay? Here are all the configurations that you can make in terms of who gets what messaging, okay? Some practices have it set up where, only the primary number, the portal user, home account email, portal user email are the ones getting messages, okay? Knowing that, hey, they collect work phone in phone field number 3, so we're not gonna send out an SMS to the work phone. Of course, the system's gonna be smart enough to know it's not, SMS, enabled, so I don't think there's much of a concern there, but, if you're storing, let's say, emergency contact there and you don't wanna text the emergency contact as part of a broadcast that you're doing, go ahead and take that out. Okay, you have that capability to customize who's going to get those messages. And again, it's going to deduplicate, but it's going to send to all those contacts there. So, if the parent has 3 different phone numbers, they're going to get pinged at each one of those. Okay. Good question. So that's where, we would enable the different contact methods. In terms of broadcast messaging, there are some layers in terms of user administration where you have to turn on broadcast message capability for specific staff, specific users at the practice. So you don't necessarily want everybody to have access to it, but, just certain gatekeepers and people who should be driving that messaging. Yes?
The number, we're at 203 area code. The number that the number our patients see when they get the message is a 475. So we get a lot of comments about, I didn't know who that was, I don't know.
Yeah, there is a challenge, a good question about the phone numbers. Right now with the tool that we use for broadcast messaging, or the vendor that we use, there are certain numbers that we have to purchase. It's called the DID number. And some states allow us to use numbers that are, these fake phone numbers that are associated then with your practice. And some states don't. So, the lack of a 203 would indicate that, the state doesn't allow that, messaging setup. Now, there are all sorts of different layers when it comes to, setting up, practices, some setups that allow you to mask the number that you're sending from, so it looks like it's coming from your practice and everything in between. So, as I mentioned, there's some research that we're doing right now about updating, giving a facelift to this, that, where I think, for us, we'd love to be able to see you folks get some masking of, your number so that it sends out looking like it's coming from your practice, not, from, a 412 or whatever area code, it happens to be. I totally get, the concern there. Unfortunately, when we set folks up, we make sure that we look to see if we can match area code. And if we can't, we have to just pick whatever's the closest proxy. So, yeah, a system limitation there with the messaging, so sorry about that.
Phone number.
Really good question. Are broadcast and Notify coming from the same place? The answer is no. And this lends to some confusion, when it comes to opting in, opting out. And I'll show you guys in the system how this works in terms of the opt-in, opt-out. But when we think about, resubscribing, opt-in and the like, anytime you see an indicator in the EHR where there's a strike through, that little bullhorn, that is anything related to email out of the system, for broadcast, or SMS related to send text, broadcast, portal notifications, things like that. Notify is on an entirely different platform. Okay, so I like to think of Notify as kind of being over here, everything else is over here. Okay, so when somebody has to opt back into Notify, they use a very specific process to do that, where opt-in and resubscribe for any EHR level communication is going to be a little bit different, okay? And that's where, through the portal and then through, a series of links, like as you click on that bullhorn, it'll give you some instructions. That's going to be specific to broadcast, send text, portal notifications, things like that. And it is confusing. I will say that, So again, as we're looking at, updates to this, we'd like to reduce that confusion, make it one single track that things are coming out of. So again, broadcast messaging can reference, all these different things. And again, the intention is really just that kind of call them all, quick notification out to your families, hey, we're closed, due to emergency, or you want to send out a quick broadcast that, hey, we've got, flu vaccines in stock, schedule your appointment, There's lots of flexible ways you can use it. What are some other creative ways that people are using broadcast? Love kind of hearing what the audience has. Yeah. So COVID clinics was, an example of one. What else?
We have patient outreach events, so celebrate Halloween with us through Trunk or Treat. We'll have a little,
what is it called? Oh, sorry.
Don't worry, I was going to repeat everything you said, so it's not.
Yeah, it's a broadcast message that tells them when we have community outreach events. So
Sure.
Hey, join us for Trunk or Treat. And it'll have a little abbreviated link with it so they can go and sign up. That way we can kind of estimate how many patients are going to actually show up for the event and plan for it appropriately.
Now, question on that, the abbreviated link, is that a link that's tied to your practice domain? Or are you using something like Bitly?
I don't think it's associated to our domain.
Okay. It's a thing to be careful of. That's an issue we run into with any sort of SMS where you're communicating using a shortened URL. The issue in particular, where these things get blocked is when you're using a link shortener that's not tied to the domain that your practice is registered with. Okay, so and this is if you've got somebody who does your website, I would talk with them about is there any sort of link shortening that they can do that's tied to your website, because that's what these intermediaries like the one that we work with and the carriers are looking for is that link that you're sending out, because we send your practice information, your EIN, all that
If it'll
stuff.
mark it as spam.
Yeah, it gets marked
I
as
see what you
spam,
mean.
and so it may go out, but then T-Mobile or AT&T or Verizon,
Yeah.
whomever decides, hey, you know what, we're going to flag that, we're going to block all the messaging, from
So far, so good. I
Good.
do have like a backup system where I look at the report that tells you how successful the send out was.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll do, sorry, I should have mentioned this too. We do limited send out at first. So we'll choose an age group to start with.
Sure.
So that it's a smaller amount going out. We did have that problem where hundreds of them failed and we were like,
Yeah.
what is going on here? And then somebody did advise us that sometimes that will make it look suspicious or spammy. So yeah, we'll do
Yeah.
a staggered send out.
No, and I'm glad to hear you say that, about the staggering, because that's actually one of the piece of advice that we do give is that, when you think about it, again, you're committing this out to the void, right? Out to all these carriers. We've done this registration process that, it's a lot of steps. We're asking you guys a lot of information. If you've gone through it recently, you're probably like, how many times do I have to change that phrasing on my website to make it match what that carrier or that intermediary wanted? But it's all with the purpose of trying to reduce spam. Now, does that reduce the number of spam calls that I get in a day? No. But we like to think that these. I feel like the policy always lags about 3-4 years behind the actual nature of things out there. So it was an attempt by the FCC and the like to try to tamp down the number of spam messages that were going out. Unfortunately, it's a lot of work, to then, go through this entire process. So, metering is what I would kind of call that, where you're sending out just a little bit at a time. Metering your messaging is a way to make sure that it doesn't hit that threshold. That then, the carriers go, wait a minute, now we've got 5,000 messages in one big batch. We gotta stop that right there. Okay. The other thing that happens too is there are daily limits, and when you guys hit a daily limit, we get notifications too from that vendor. You guys never even see it. That say, hey, T-Mobile just said that they hit the 5,000 benchmark. Can we clear this to upgrade them to the next level? Yeah, sure. But so it's on a permission basis. So nobody ever gets cleared to the highest level first. They always start small, and then we just build up from there. So that's something else to note.
So it's better to not send 5,000 out at once?
I mean, depending, that could work. The thing with this that's so hard, and I'm maybe getting ahead of myself here a little bit, is these rules exist, but they don't tell us. Nobody tells you what the rules actually are, and they do that on purpose. Because the whole idea is that they want to create these filters, these algorithms that are completely opaque, so that spammers don't know what the ways around are. With AI these days, I mean, they figure it out pretty quickly. But theoretically, the idea is that we're not going to tell you what the limits are. You just have to kind of guess, right? And so, we learn through trial and error, and that's where, hey, maybe 1,000 is fine, maybe 5,000 isn't, right? If you do run up against the limit, we fix it, okay? So I think, better to aim a little bit smaller and meter, as opposed to sending everything out at once. But if you happen to send, 5,000, 10,000, you're like, oh, shoot, we'll fix it, okay?
We've had really good luck with using this for overdue physicals.
Yeah.
I mean, we send them out, we batch them. We don't send them all out at once because the appointment desk hates me when I do that. But it's really worked.
Yeah.
It really has, and I think it's just part of the process now. We have it scheduled, so it goes out.
That's awesome. I mean, when I think about it too now, we've got self-scheduling, right? So you can literally just tell them hey, visit the portal, and if you don't have a portal, reach out to us and we'll get you set up. So, again, we've tried to build all these tools now that I think are working better together, and can support each other. And so, yeah, you don't even have to use Notify. You can just use Broadcast to do this. So there were some other hands up.
We use it to report on who came yesterday to their appointment and ask them for a Google review.
Awesome. Yeah. Surveys, that's a big one. I think, especially right now with all the challenges you deal with where, anti-vaxxers and other folks are, hitting your Google and the like, negatively, leverage those appointments that you just had, send out that survey, boost your reviews, but also learn a little bit about, how you guys are doing realistically. Like, where are their problems? Do we have a person at the front desk who folks really don't like, but, they look fine to us, but, we come to find out that, they've been mistreating, patients and families. Like, you can learn a lot about your practice through, the eyes of the patients. Some other hands up.
We use it like in our state, when they start the 7th grade, that they have to have certain vaccines before they move on. So usually at the end of this month, beginning of August, we'll send them out to all of our adolescents who are going into the 7th grade to recoup those, and then it also gets them caught up on like their well child checks as well.
Awesome. Yeah, so you're doing, 2 birds with 1 stone there. You've got, well child checks that you're bringing them in for, get them up to date on vaccinations. Are you using the vaccine overdue reports to do that? Or perfect, okay, so we'll take a look at that too, because we have these reports now that we've built. So if you've got forecasting turned on, and most everybody should, you can leverage those reports as a way to get those folks in the door. Because if they're overdue, for the vaccines, they're definitely gonna be overdue for the well visit too. All righty, other question?
Are there any wishing well things for this to be more automated? Like, I want this report to run every day and send this out, and I don't ever want to touch it.
There certainly are. First off, that's one we've heard, from folks where I would love to be able to set up my broadcast on a schedule and have that automated through broadcast. Not, that it's a scheduled report that we run and we can see the results and then we have to do something else with it. Or I have to run, my broadcast out, manually to get those, broadcasts out. So it's definitely a wish that's out there. And, again, we're looking at, big picture changing how notification works. And so, these are all things that, we'd like to see. Did I see another hand up in the back? Okay. I should look over this way too to see if anybody from FWP is raising their hands. Hey guys. So at any rate, so that's really great examples. I appreciate you guys throwing some of that out there because I think it's also helpful for the folks who are not using it in that manner, but also the folks who are at home and wondering, hey, like, how can we really boost the usage of this particular tool and the communication with patients and families. So SendText, the purpose behind SendText really was, that on-demand, individual messaging with patients. So, the classic example that we used during COVID was, please wear a mask, and so it was your chance to send that out to, an individual. Here's the exam room that you're going to, or, meet us at this door. It was that, real-time messaging, one way, not 2 ways, although they can send a reply back. So the phone numbers that are there, let's talk about that for a second here. So when I go to send a SendText, out, there are 2 ways that I can do this. One is I can do it from the schedule screen. And, the nice part about the schedule screen is I can see everybody who's there and I can, individually go through and, choose that patient and, or, excuse me, hit, the SendText button, choose that patient, pick the phone number, and reply back. Or reply to them with something. One thing that we see folks run into is they might free text a number in here. And I don't know if this has happened to anybody where you free text a number and then you realize you sent a message out to the wrong person. And you're like, hey, PCC, can you remove that number for us? And the answer, unfortunately, right now is no, we can't. It exists in a part of the database that we really can't remove data from, okay? When we think about the way that we've structured our database, there's these logs, these audits that tell us all the touch points in the system, and we really can't remove data from audit logs. Okay, what this draws on is those audit type logs. I wish it didn't, but right now you can free text a number in there. I encourage you to be really cautious because usually where I see people get burned with this is they're doing it from the schedule screen. Okay, they were just looking at a record, they have a report in front of them, they start typing, they've got the wrong kid pulled up here, okay? What I do encourage, too, with SendText is this can be done from inside the chart, So it's not always the best place to do it. There may be reasons that you're using the schedule screen in terms of the speed. You're looking ahead of day and you're sending out individual texts. Be careful. Use the text or the numbers that are in that dropdown, okay? Inside that dropdown, you're gonna have fields that are labeled with the demographic data, okay? If they've opted out, that number, I believe, won't even show in that particular field. So like if I had opted out from messaging, in fact, let me test this out real quick. Because I think I have actually opted out from messaging for this patient here. But as I recall, when we opt out, yeah, I was opted out, now I'm not. Oh, no, I am. Oh, it's from my email, damn. Okay, let's fix that real quick. Okay, perfect, the message actually went through. So now I'm opted out for messaging. You can see the little bullhorn, that's my cell phone. Don't commit it to memory. So here, if I go to send text, I guess it does. So what'll happen is it won't let you, I think, I might have to type some text in here. Will it let me send? Well, I learned something new today. I thought that it would remove it from the field there.
And that didn't say sent. Sometimes it says sent.
Sometimes it says sent, sometimes it doesn't. So yeah, the issue there is that there's communication out to those third-party intermediary, or to the third-party intermediary, and then there's the communication out to the carriers. So when you think about it, there's like a couple hops in the chain. It goes out from PCC, it hits that place, and then it heads out to the carriers. If the carrier doesn't send us back a response within a few seconds, we don't show sent. We don't show a check mark to indicate that it was successful. Okay, so that is a challenge with send text right now. That it's not necessarily an immediate result out or back. At any rate, so it looks like you can text out to a number that's been opted out. I thought previously that we had removed that, but it could be again a test environment, and so.
They're not going to get it?
They wouldn't get that text message in that case. All right, I wouldn't. In fact, if I look at my phone right now, there's definitely not a text message in there. Yes, Eleanor.
Is there a record of that being sent?
There is. We do keep a record. I was going to get into reporting a little bit later, but since we're in here and talking about send text, might as well take a look at some of the reports. Okay. So inside the report library, we house the communication logs related to broadcast and send text. We've put those appropriately under communication. So in here, you've got a series of PCC built reports. Any of those ones that have the little PCC icon are the PCC specific reports. So question is can we see those messages? Do they exist anywhere in the system? And they do. So the single text log right here, you can view single text patient messages that you've sent out. Okay. And as we click this, we can search for a patient, or we can look at like the last 30 days, just across everybody. And if I hit generate, this is going to send, or this is going to share what we sent out. Now, message status here of unknown. This particular test environment, doesn't necessarily get back great results, always from the carriers, but typically you're going to see some kind of message status. Sometimes it's going to be unknown. Sometimes it's going to be failed, or that there was a bounce. If you're seeing a lot of unknown message statuses here, if everything's saying unknown, reach out to us. Okay, it's always possible that there's something in the back end that we need to tweak a little bit with that vendor to make sure that those responses are coming back appropriately. Question.
Is it possible for the billing account to also receive the reminders? At least in my practice, when we sent out reminders, only the account home number are the ones who receive the reminders. So let's say dad is in home and mom is in billing, but mom doesn't want dad to receive the reminders. How can that be fixed, or what you recommend? Yeah,
it's a good question. How would you customize your reminders? When we think about broadcast was built, really for the home account. Okay. The portal user piece, the fact that we can grab portal user information, is a way to then convey messaging to another account, another person associated with the patient. But with Notify does give you the capability to message both, and or home and billing. So you can choose, which numbers you're tagging first. I do have some practices that we've worked with where they send out every day 2 notifications to the family, one to one number, one to another. because they want to make sure that they're catching both. I think they're in a situation where they've got a number of split families that they want to account for, and so that's how they do it, is they send one message out to home, one message out to billing. So that can be customized within Notify. It would just be a matter of chatting with us, and we can work with you to customize that. Yeah. And with the billing account, you have the same capability in terms of email, text, phone number or phone call. All that exists with the billing account the way that it does with the home account too, with Notify. Good question. Alrighty, so back to our send text here. Again, I want to caution folks, when you're using that drop-down, look for the phone numbers that are in parentheses that say things like cell phone or primary number. Those are going to be the phone numbers that are registered with your account. Those are the ones that if you're using pre-check-in are also getting updated regularly. Those should be current. If there's not a phone number listed there, I just wonder, okay, so what do you need to do to update that record? Are you trying to text a phone number for Dad, but Dad's not listed there? Maybe add him as a portal account. Make sure that he's got his phone number there moving forward, okay? Because we will reference portal account phone numbers as well in here. Yes?
But is it not still true that pre-check-in, if you accept a new number, it wipes that little stuff you've added?
Yeah, so the question is, does pre-check-in wipe the stuff you've added? So what you're talking about, I think, is when we're in the EHR here, let me go into the demographic record, we'll edit, and I'm going to change the phone number here for Francine. So now the 802-555-0108 has MW, okay, to indicate mom work, okay, or just, MC, mom cell, whatever. When we built pre-check-in, the thing that we know is that we're sending this information out for folks to confirm or, to update, right? The problem is, if we send out something that says mom or MW, they're not going to know necessarily what that is, okay? So we made the decision to remove that text, when that information gets sent out through pre-check-in. If you're using pre-check-in and they hit confirm, it is going to wipe that out on the return. You get the option, of course, to uncheck that in pre-check-in to say, I don't want to import that phone number as if I want to kind of keep that text in there, but that is correct. That text, if you're using pre-check-in, does become problematic, and it's probably going to get wiped out at some point, in the process of confirming the information. So, are there a lot of folks who are using that, ancillary text at the end of phone numbers? Okay. One thing I would suggest considering, and we've seen more people moving in this direction, is we have these custom fields over on the side for the account. People use these for a variety of reasons. Some things that are older information that you no longer need, vestiges like pharmacy number. I probably don't need the pharmacy number any longer here because we have ERX, right? So I would get rid of that field and I would use it for something like primary number name, secondary number name. We're seeing more and more folks do this as a way to capture that information. You're not going to get that when you get pre-check-in data back. You're going to get back a phone number. But when they're at the front desk and you say, hey, so the number that ends in 0108, is that mom's number or dad's number? Okay? And this is your chance to plug that information in. I think in the future, there's a desire for us to change a little bit of how we structure those numbers to give, some attribution. And it's something that we've looked at, but, yeah, a drop down would be great, just something to attribute those numbers. So, it's something that we've heard from folks, and we would definitely love to do at some point, is, number attribution. Is there a question over there?
Yeah, quick question. I think you answered this before about not being able to eliminate the phone number but from a different area you were in. When you change the phone numbers in the demographics, that stays. But if you were to send a phone note to a nurse or a doctor, and then you have that drop-down menu, all the numbers that were previously associated with the account show up. So that's there forever. You can never get rid of those.
Oh, so in a phone note, you can actually change those.
I've never been able to get rid of a number that's no longer in demographics, but it still shows up in the drop-down when you're making a phone note.
Yeah, so I think you're talking about the return phone field here. Is that correct? Yeah. There's a right-click capability for delete phone numbers in here. If you've manually added a phone number, if it's not part of the demographic record, but you've manually added it, you can remove that number from here. But it has to be one that was manually added. If it's something that's still part of the demographic record in any place, that's still going to remain. It would have to be changed inside demographics, like account demographics, for it to be removed. The other place where people, see this happen sometimes is like the caller name, right? In that dropdown, I've seen this come up where somebody's like, hey, there's a parent who's deceased, but their name is showing here. How do I get rid of that? That references all the callers that you've had historically, okay? So what you might want to do in that case is you could always go back to an older note and update it to, like, say, deceased, next to the name, so that you're not confusing, your folks, like they're wondering, hey, is this, Maureen who's calling? And like, that's going to be a triggering event for that person, okay? You want to make sure that you update that accordingly, because that, again, is just referencing old information at that point. Alrighty, good question. So back to Centex again, numbers, removal of numbers is something that we are considering for the future with the system. So patient portal, again, as we're talking about all this and like, the idea of, hey, we're sending out, broadcasts, and now with self-scheduling, we can drive people to the portal to do scheduling. The portal is yet another way that, we're using the system to communicate with patients and families. And the nice part about this is all delivered to that queue, for messaging. You have folks who are responding to that, throughout the day. Responses are coming back in. The challenge with it, of course, is, some folks like to use portal messaging as more urgent, need as opposed to reaching out to you, especially after hours and the like, so it's not perfect, but it is a useful tool for communication. And the thing to think about, again, is that pre-check-in notification, which we send out, up to 48 hours in advance of that visit, or, within 48 hours if it's scheduled, it's like 5 minutes after the scheduling that it sends out. That serves, again, as another reminder of appointments. So, when you've built your notifications, you build out your broadcast or Centex structure, for how you're communicating with folks, consider this again, that if you've now set up pre-check-in, you want to make sure that you're adjusting that cadence accordingly. If you've got reminders going out 2 days in advance through Notify, maybe it's time to push those to 3 or put them to 1, whatever it is, so that you're not, hitting them twice over with 2 notifications. And we've had a lot of folks, reach out to us to adjust, their cadence accordingly. So yeah, this kind of gets again to that best practices. Just consider how often are you communicating with your families. When we're talking about content of messaging, this is where you want to be really careful with, especially broadcast or send text. When we register you folks for broadcast and send text with SMS, we're registering you specifically for medical practice information, okay? So, if you're sending something out that's like, you're talking about like the community outreach piece, I think, that kind of thing, falls in line with, part of your practice. It's, ancillary services or things that you're doing to support your community. I think those kinds of things are generally fine. Where you're gonna get in trouble is, if there's any sort of solicitation, there are all sorts of, like, when you look at, the systems and the guardrails that are out there, I think, you guys aren't dermatology, so it's not like you're selling Botox or something like that. But, like, if you were selling anything, if there's any sort of solicitation, that's gonna get flagged, that's gonna get you blocked. And unfortunately, when you get blocked, it can take a good number of days to get unblocked. And the thing to consider with this too is that this number that's associated with your practice is not just for broadcasts and not just for send text. It's your portal notifications, okay? It's your pre-check-in reminders. It's all those things wrapped up in one. So you want to be mindful, okay, that you're not overdoing it. And again, I wish I could say, hey, after this many messages, that there's going to be a block in place. I think we've gotten, more savvy with and more agile around, fixing that, as has, the vendor that we work with. So downtime is pretty limited, for any sort of overage. And in general, smaller batches, better acceptance rate. And that was with the caveat again that we do increase those limits as needed. So if we find out that T-Mobile got ornery that you guys sent out 5K, well, we'll adjust it so it's now 10, okay? That's the challenge, is, there's no hard and fast rule that says, if you do 1,000, you're fine, and 1,001 is gonna get you in trouble. Because again, they don't let us know. The carriers won't tell you like this many messages is gonna cause an issue. I will say, generally speaking, that about $1,000, anything over that, you can probably start to expect, some potential flagging. But, if we've already had to increase limits for you, you're arguably gonna be fine.
You let us know, we can flag.
I mean, usually, again, the way that the flagging works is that we get the heads up from the vendor, and they say, can we increase the limit? And we go, sure. And that's all that ever happens, really, with it. It used to be different. Before we had, this kind of modified process or this newer process in place, where there was a lot more communication, between the carriers, the vendor that we work with, and PCC. Those blocks would happen. It would take days sometimes before things were fixed. Now it's really just a matter of them reaching out to say, is it okay to do this? We do it, and then the messages go out. So downtime is limited to maybe sometimes even 15 minutes or something like that. And you guys will never notice it on your end. So it's a much better process than it used to be.
Is that expansion thing temporarily or from now on?
That's from now on. Yep. Because again, the way that folks get registered for these numbers, they always start you at the smallest level, okay? And we have to build up from there. It doesn't make much sense for us to say, hey, let's clear you for 20,000 messages if you're never going to send that. And again, there have to be kind of campaigns and reasoning behind this. They want to see that you're actually going to send that many messages before we clear you for it. It's not dissimilar to with eLabs where we have to send out first to get something back to your compendium. Same kind of concept where they need to kind of prove that you're actually going to send out that many messages. So when we think about regulatory compliance, there's a couple of different things here to kind of cover. I mean, the opting in and resubscribing, we've got all sorts of processes that are around that that we've had to adhere to because we're told by the carriers and by Google and Amazon Web Services that you have to operate this way. Okay, we wish it wasn't the kind of hoop jumping that you need to go through, but it's imposed by those carriers. There are things to do to avoid being blacklisted, and I think that's the stuff that we're talking about here. Not overdoing it with your messaging, being really cautious about the content so that you're not stepping outside of what is considered medical practice type information. And we want to make sure that you're complying with those industry regulations throughout. So as I said, broadcast and send text and portal notifications, they all use that same email and SMS platform. This is different from Notify, okay? So when somebody opts out of one, they're opting out of all of them, okay? And I think, unfortunately, that's not always apparent. They get a broadcast from me, they go, I'm going to unsubscribe from that, and then they find out, that they're not getting pre-check notifications or asking why that is, okay? In those cases, you're going to have to remind them, we send out messaging, and, it's through these medium, so when you unsubscribe, you're doing it from all, and here's how to resubscribe. Now, this is where it gets a little bit interesting in terms of unsubscribing and resubscribing. We can send out, for emails, for example, we can send out an additional email after a patient or family has unsubscribed. We can invite them, to resubscribe if they've unsubscribed. If it's been marked as spam or junk, it's a different story. Okay, and this is where again there's an imposition of rules, from the big players where, we can't send out an email in this case to those folks. They need to go find an email to resubscribe, okay? So they need to look in their junk folder. They need to resolve whatever the issue is in terms of why it's being marked as spam or why it's being marked as junk, and white label that email address from you folks before they can proceed, okay? And it's a bit of a hoop, unfortunately, that they have to jump through, but it's not one that PCC is imposing. It's one that's being imposed by, again, Google, Amazon. If we run afoul of that, it's the kind of thing that could actually shut down your email altogether out of your practice. So it's a startlingly small threshold. When we learned about what that threshold is, I want to say it's 1.5% is the, if there's that many emails that are marked as spam or junk coming out of your practice, that's enough to go, enough is enough, okay? And if Google or Amazon shuts you down, you're dead in the water, okay? So we need to be really careful with that. So anyway, that's why we've set up these, systems in this way so that, when a simple unsubscribe, you can revert that with an invite, but with junk or spam, they need to go fix that themselves and then resubscribe from a previous email. The SMS side is a lot easier, okay? That part, you simply just send back a start, okay, or unstop. And there's a few other flavors of resubscribe that are accepted, and that'll get them back in to SMS. Notify, there was a question earlier about are the notifications different than the send text broadcast? Different process altogether, okay? That one, there's a single number that sends out messaging for Televox, and that's that 622-622 number, okay? That number is actually across all of our practices. Everybody uses 622-622. Anybody who uses Televox, for non-pediatric medicine uses 622-622. So it's this, universal number, and that's where you guys have like that special practice code, okay? When we registered you for Televox, you would have had some buzzword. It might be a shorthand of your practice name. There was a practice we worked with a while back that their text was fish because they had an aquarium in the front of the office, and that's how patients do them. So they would text fish to 622-622, and that's how they opted back in, okay? So you're gonna use that text to get opted back into messaging from, Notify. So again, we've talked a lot about, avoiding the blacklist and, like, how do you make sure that, this doesn't happen? That algorithm, unfortunately, it's opaque. It's not something that we see. We can only guess at based on, what we've learned, what those thresholds might be. That's where, 1,000, 5,000, like there's some of these benchmarks where beyond a certain amount, you can expect a flag, okay? But again, the work that we do on the back end is pretty quick to, fix that. Where we run into more issues, there's the volume limitations, but it's the content limitations. Those are the ones that really stop you for a little bit longer, okay? Volume limitations, we can fix pretty quickly and, get you running up and running again. When your content is being blocked, that's where it takes a little bit longer. And, the biggest blocker that we see is those URL shorteners. So that's, again, be really cautious with those in particular. If you're using tinyURL, Bitly, any of those kinds of things, those things just get blocked many times. Think about, like, I remember I used to get a number of spam texts, almost on a daily basis that would have Bitly or, tinyURL and all these other shorteners, and those stopped all of a sudden, I get links still, but they're now like a new domain or something that I've never seen before. It's like, okay, well, what is this? They're finding ways around, like which ones are allowed, which ones aren't gonna be blocked, but the carriers have really put the kibosh on Bitly and tinyURL. Usually somebody tries to send out a text with that and they're blocked immediately. So the key there is, again, we register your domain, your practice website. If you have a shortener that's tied to like your domain, that will typically get through in those cases. So something to consider, especially we were talking about the idea of like, some of those outreach events and, things where you're linking out so that you don't end up in, hot water with them, even for a couple of days, it's a good idea to look into that, okay? And typically, whoever's doing your website or whichever, if you're using like WordPress or whatever, for hosting your site, there are ways typically to shorten the URL to match your domain, okay? Yeah, so again, there are those volume limitations. No specific number of messages can cause a restriction. Those rules will vary by carrier and are not public knowledge. And again, when those limits are hit, we fix the issue. If it was something really concerning, we would certainly reach out. But generally speaking, it's all behind the scenes. You guys won't even notice it happen. And when it comes down to complying with industry regulations, the thing to keep in mind is that, there are these constant updates to like CAN-SPAM and, the FCC's TCPA. We recently, learned that there were going to be changes to some of the words that folks are able to use to, unsubscribe or rather resubscribe. And so, we've got to make sure that, we've updated things accordingly. This is all the kind of stuff that we have to do behind the scenes, in the background. You guys don't really need to worry about, but, we're constantly making these adjustments, working with those third parties to make sure that, our system complies, so that you guys aren't, penalized for being out of compliance. In terms of questions around, is it legal to send, this versus that? I really caution folks, touch base with your practice attorney. There are going to be certain, local rules and state level rules that we can't really answer, to, but, we can tell you that generally speaking, you've been cleared for medical information, general practice information, and, not much else beyond that. So that's where the solicitations and things like that you want to be really careful with. We do have a best practices document on learn.pcc.com. If I click here, this should take me to that URL there. And it gives you some of the best practices for sending messages to patients and families. We put together, based on what we have learned over time, the kind of rules and best practice guidelines. So, it talks a little about numbers and trying to meter and all that kind of stuff, getting explicit consent, written permission for texting, emailing, and calling your families, making sure that you've got those things in place as well. And where did my presentation go? I think it took me out. There we go. And if you want to make adjustments to things like Notify, and how you're messaging your families, let us know. I mean, we can work with you folks to adjust things like your trailer messages, your cancel versus confirm, any of that kind of setup. We're happy to assist with. So again, we talked a little bit about reports and logs, and we've got a whole bunch of them that exist inside the report library that we recommend you make use of as you are monitoring communication. Some of those reports, we looked at briefly the single text log for send out. We actually break these into two different types of logs. So we've got the single text log, which shows you all the single text that you sent out from your practice. But there's a question of what are the responses that you get back, okay? If you haven't looked at the inbound messages before, I highly recommend you take a look because you'll find some interesting things in there. You might be entertained. You might also be a little shocked. You might want to flag an account or three after you see some of the things that they say. But you can go ahead and generate this, and this is going to show you everything that they sent back. And this will show you the unstops, the starts, all that kind of stuff too. I sent in a text, yesterday afternoon that says, "I'll send a virtual card via the portal. I don't have a hard copy." And when I sent that text, I got a message back that says, "This number is not monitored for replies." Okay. You could also put something in, "This number is not monitored for replies, reach out to us through the portal," or something like that. You can keep it short and sweet, but instruct them on ways to actually communicate with you that are accessible and are real time. And this again, as we're looking at a facelift to our notification, this is something we're considering too, is how do we accept messaging back in two-way so that there isn't this barrier between your patients and families and you. Because as useful as the portal is, people like to text, so we want to create something that's a bit more real time in that regard. So there's that report. Other reports that I highly recommend using, looking at your broadcasts, keeping an eye on those. If you send a big broadcast out, make sure that you're getting responses back. If there's an issue, that'll flag it right there. You might see some concerns. Reach out to PCC. We can intervene as necessary. We may already have by the time you reach out to us, and that's where you're going to see the broadcast message details will show you all the message attempts from a single broadcast run, where the broadcast message log shows you all the broadcasts that you've done. Okay, so that's the full log of everything. Another call out that I want to make real quick in terms of talking about how to engage with your patients and families. I really want to try to drive people to the portal. So how many of you have used the Patients with Portal Users report as a way to send a broadcast to get people on the portal? How many of you have used the Patients with Portal Users report as a way to generate a list of people who need a portal user and then send a broadcast to get them on the portal? So this is something to consider using, okay? Patients with Portal Users, when I click into this, I can choose whether they have a portal account or not. I would use Patients Without, add in any of the flags that I want to exclude by. So inactive and everything else in between. Just gonna hit save real quick and hit generate. This ran really fast last night. It's this Wi-Fi, and you got everybody else looking at things at the same time. So, roughly speaking, I think there were about 2,000 or so patients in this this data set. What I can do is, based on that list here, I can hit export and, let them know, hey, we'd love to get you signed up for the portal. Please reach out to us. Okay. This becomes yet another method, of outreach. If you're trying to boost your self-scheduling, boost pre-check-in totals, things like that, this is a great tool, okay? I would highly recommend, using this and keeping up on it too. It might be the kind of thing that, every month you run it and look to see, who hasn't responded and, get another, batch of these out. So you might also get some replies back. It'd be really interesting to take a look at that, inbound messages list to see what kind of responses you're getting from people. And perhaps exclude them with a flag, moving forward. So that's
Jim,
something.
really quick,
Yes.
Can you use this just for the people coming in that day, so you can select it for who has an appointment?
I'm trying to think if there's a way that we can do that. Let me take a look here. When we have like the huddle sheet, we have the appointment reports. I don't know if we can filter on portal user within those, but let's take a look. Yeah, the question was, I think hopefully caught most of it on the mic, but is there any way to send out a report probably to patients and families who don't have a portal user who are coming in for appointments, maybe like a day or two in advance or whatever? Yeah, I was looking, let's see. Yeah, so probably appointment report. Let's see if there's a filter here for that.
Jim, can you customize the patients with portal users report? Can you customize that report?
You can, I think you customize it to a bit, but I don't think you can do it by based on appointments is the problem that we've run into with that. So let's see. Yeah, I was looking to see if there's a patient portal users one. Yeah, I don't think that we have that. No, there is a portal user column, but not a criteria, I believe, is the problem. Now we have things like outstanding personal balance. Yeah, we don't have that in particular that I'm aware of, because I feel like I've heard this one before and I wanted to refresh my memory on it, but I don't think that there's one that looks at just the upcoming appointments. I mean, what you could do, this is where you might use single text, as a way to invite people, or send text, generate that huddle sheet or generate that appointment report, look to see who doesn't have one, and then follow up with them that way, as opposed to through broadcast. Yeah, where broadcast is more just like a catch-em-all for the patients with portal users. I'll take a look though. If there's something that I'm missing, Dr. Craig, I'll let you know. Maybe have Kate send that along to you.
We have some feedback from the chat, portal users by appointment date.
Oh,
I don't think that's another one, unless you're familiar with that.
I mean, we add new reports all the time, and I may not be familiar with it. Let's take a look. That notification was great. Yeah, there is portal user by appointment date. So the question is, can we customize this in any way to select? Yeah, there's no criteria here that's going to exclude, I think, patients who don't have, or exclude patients who have a portal user so that you could then use this to broadcast off of. I think that's really the challenge with this, is that you want something that can filter that list down to who has it and who doesn't. And I think the patients with portal users is really the report that we've created for that. Yep, in the back.
Curious what age practices have teenagers join the portal and what parameters they put around parents' access to their portal. We have Oregon law, so we have to kind of comply with certain things, but starting to understand maybe we can get more creative about it, but I'd love to learn more.
Yeah, so the question was, what are folks doing to, I think, manage, teenager access, parent access around age of emancipation? I think that's really a question to really all of you. How are you handling that?
Our hospital does. I'm from Vermont. So they start at 12, having folks have their kids sign a release when they have a visit there. So 12 is usually the age that we say, hey, we're going to sign you up for the portal. We also have a texting vendor that we use that it's been a game changer as far as our adolescent population goes. So, yeah, consent.
Another hand over here. Down in front.
Hi, so we are in Connecticut, and we are debating what to do because there are definitely laws that protect certain, confidential information about adolescents, and we've trialed because a lot of the hospitals in our area make the portals not available to kids after age, or to parents after age 12, so age 13 and above. But we're running into a lot of issues, and we're kind of now trying to decide if we should reopen the portal and lock some of the diagnoses, because what we're finding is the parents have no access to the portal, if I'm understanding that correctly. They can't get in, they can't schedule appointments or get appointment reminders. I'm not exactly sure what they're able to see, but they're able to see a lot less, and we're running into snags. And I was wondering if anybody else had that experience or what they're doing.
Yeah, I think, in terms of I'll speak at least to the software side, for us, I mean, there are certain elements that are limited and some that are not. So when we think about the idea of sending a message in, something you can do. As a portal user, can you see the chart and look at the information? No, in those cases. There's restrictions, I think, self-scheduling right now, we can't, schedule for patients who are emancipated, but we can pay balances, for example. And so, it's kind of bit by bit and piece by piece. I mean, we also have to evaluate, case by case, how we do these things. And, so a lot of times, like when we're first releasing a piece of software, we go, okay, let's do it without worrying about that piece just yet, so that we can get it out the door, like self-scheduling, and then come back to it, after the fact. But this is a real challenge in general with age of emancipation. I understand, why, states have done this, but it also does, create some impediments. And so, yeah, I'm curious what other folks are doing. I mean, I can.
What other people are doing, if anyone else is doing. No.
Yeah, Eleanor.
We're in California, so we don't have that same age issue. Ours is 18. And so we have our patients sign a consent when they come in for their annual physical. So either before they turn 18, they sign a consent, and it's very detailed consent. Do you want your parent to have access to this, X, Y, and Z? And they have to initial it to say yes, that they can access these things, so that they understand how in-depth, the medical information is. And so they'll sign off on it. We give them a status. Our status is like 18 consent or something like that. So if they have that, then we go ahead and give the parent the access. And if not, it just locks them out, and we create a portal for the patient. But 12 is hard. That's a hard age.
Really?
Yeah, it's a tough one. I mean, I have to assume, I mean, without making too many assumptions here, I mean, can you have family or have those patients sign off on a document that gives their parents access, or is it a complete shutdown?
Well, I think it depends on what it is.
Yeah.
So like a lot of the screenings, we're doing STI screening,
Sure.
things like that, and so it's rough. I mean, that's supposed to be protected information.
Yeah, so I can do a quick recap here.
Yeah.
So what it comes down to is that, there are going to be certain elements that, you want to make sure are hidden and some that aren't. So that's where, I think we have made the configuration such inside the portal where, for labs and things like that, I would want to just mark those things as confidential by default in your system so that they're not shared out. And then you can decide, does this actually get shared, to the portal in those specific instances or not. And you can really take a look at your configuration. I mean, while you have these blanket boxes that say like screenings or referrals or labs, individually those items can be set to confidential by default, and you should be setting those confidential by default. So like, STI screens, pregnancy tests, things like that, I think most of that stuff should be confidential by default. Some people even take it the next step and they make all the labs confidential, and then they turn back around and say, hey, can we fix that? Because now we're supposed to unveil all this information. So we've had to do that too, where we then go through and update everything all at once. But you do have that granular control when it comes to the orders specifically, or diagnoses as well, where diagnoses can be confidential. So that's something to keep in mind. What I always recommend to folks, because this question always comes up, and I'll keep pushing. I'd love to see us have like a preview what the portal looks like button inside the EHR. But short of having that, this is where I say set up a fake patient, do a little bit of charting, play around with it, and look to see like what would you see for that patient. I think that's the best way to understand how the portal actually works, and what your families are seeing is to just have a representative copy of that you can then tweak a little bit and build your configuration off of that. A lot of good questions. So yeah, we're pretty much at the wrap-up part of the presentation. I'll just open it up to questions at this point. But big takeaways here. If you learned anything today, the Notify automated reminders. We can customize those for you folks. in terms of that trailer messaging or, which methods it's using. If you want to update some of your phone fields to be a little bit more modern, to work well with patient pre-check-in and better leverage Notify, reach out to us. We can help you with that. Broadcast, heard a lot of really good use cases for how you guys are using broadcast. Hopefully some, good takeaways here, that you can start using in your practice. Send text, great at that direct, messaging. You do have that inbound log to take a look at periodically, both for, follow-up and entertainment purposes. The patient portal, has some of those built-in appointment reminders now that pre-check is available. And we've got a whole bunch of these guardrails, that we've set up, with the third party that we work with, to make sure that your messaging is, both going out but also complying with the regulations that are in place. So at this point, I'd open up to you guys. Are there any other questions you want to ask? Yeah, Eleanor.
So on Notify, I heard you say something about Televox. So that's what you mean when you say they're able to communicate back with us, is because you create the background stuff in Notify so that then Televox can...
Yeah, Televox is the intermediary that we work with for Notify. They have been for a while.
Okay.
We've built Notify as a platform that, takes all those reports out of PCC, sends them out, with the customizations that we've built, to Televox. They do delivery. They send back statuses on those appointments, and those appointments then, can be automatically canceled, from your schedule, and viewed in terms of reporting.
Is Televox the only vendor that you all work with?
That is the only vendor we work with right now.
Okay, because they've done some updating, and I feel like the reporting that we get back is, we have 2 locations.
Yeah.
And so we asked to print the report for, to see who's confirmed. And it prints the report for both locations, all doctors, in time order, and so it's all over the place.
Okay.
With their newest update, not that you can do anything about
we should,
that, but I just wondered, because then it made me think, well, I wonder if they work with other vendors, because the previous reporting used to be super simplified by location, by doctor, and so you're making callbacks based on those batches, right? Now it's kind of just all over the place, and it's got to be on a Word, Excel spreadsheet, and anyway, and so what we said to them was we'd like them to look into it further, and maybe there are other vendors, and that made them let us we'll work on it and see. But I just wondered if anybody else was having those issues with Televox, or have they reported those issues?
I will say, I'm glad you're mentioning something, because we should definitely chat. You guys, I think, still use the old Televox program that we have in PCC.
Of course, we would use the old.
Yeah, which we replaced the old Televox program with the Notify program.
Oh, maybe you're. I think you're right.
So we should chat.
we type Televox.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. that might be why.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
The reporting that we have set up in the Notify program is broken out by however your batches are built. So most practices where they have multiple locations have batch by location, and they don't run into this issue. So we should definitely chat more.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, question in the back.
I would like to piggyback on the vendor.
Yeah.
Like I mentioned before, we are using a texting platform vendor that it's been a game changer for the practice. Obviously, they're not integrated with PCC yet, but where are you all at with choosing a vendor to do that?
We've been in a research phase, looking at a bunch of different vendors, interviewed a bunch. Which vendor in particular?
OMD.
OMD, yep.
They're right down the road from us.
Yeah.
Their culture is very much like PCC, so it was a no-brainer for us. Not to mention they're literally right down the street from us.
Yeah, we're familiar with them. We've definitely chatted with a lot of different folks. So, anytime we're looking at, different vendors and things like that, we're evaluating a lot of different, variables in terms of functionality, what we want to be able to do. So, yeah, I appreciate you bringing up their name. We've definitely had some chats. There are a lot of really great vendors out there. I think for us, the big key as we look at anything is, what we're trying to do, and whether any vendor can match what we're trying to give you guys for functionality. So ultimately, whenever we make a choice about how to build this and how to leverage tools, we're always looking at Okay, can they handle reminders? Can they handle, broadcasts? Can they handle billing reminders? They have to be able to do it all, right? And do it in a way that is going to work well for our practices. So, yeah, there's a bunch of folks who are in consideration right now.
Great, I hope they're at the top of your list. Selfish plug, and they're not paying me.
We had a plant in the room. Alrighty, any other questions, folks? Yes, up front.
I thought I heard you mention the Notify, we're paying for those messages, but the texts and the broadcast messages we don't pay extra for?
Correct. So Notify, that particular platform, does charge, per message that's successful, okay? If the message is not, if it's blocked for some reason, it's unsuccessful, there's no charge for that. The broadcast and Centex platform, we built that during, COVID, different platform altogether, and we chose at that point not to charge, and we've continued not to charge for that. Alrighty. Other questions? Well, looks like we finished about 5 minutes early here. Any questions from the online crew? Alrighty. Thank you, folks.